Welcome back to the One God Report podcast. This is Bill Schlegel, episode number 119, called When Were the Gospels Written? Before we get into that, just a couple of announcements. First of all, the Church of God General Conference Youth Conference is going to be held July 14th through 19th. That's a Sunday through a Friday in North Manchester, Indiana at North Manchester University campus. It's a great time. I plan to be there teaching a class. Just to mention one other name, Sean Finnegan, host of the Restitutio podcast, will be there teaching as well. But in general, they have a highly dedicated staff and teaching crew. It's a great time, good mixture of both classes and just overall good time for the kids, sports activities. The kids really make good friends there. If you'd like to get a little sample, see the podcast called Teaching the Next Generation that Yud-He Vav-He is Our God. So get your kids signed up. There's a discount for early signees, but the time is coming up soon. If you've got kids or know any from high school to college age, it's a fantastic time. See the show notes for a link. And then October 17 through 20 is the UCA Unitarian Christian Alliance Conference in Little Rock, Arkansas. If you haven't been to one of these conferences and you're a One God believer, it's a fantastic time to meet people, lots of discussions about religious and theological topics. I recommend coming and participating. You'll enjoy it. Now, on to our topic, the dating of the Gospels. When were the Gospels written? Sometimes this study is called historical criticism. The word criticism can have a negative connotation to it. It doesn't necessarily mean that. It could be understood more as evaluation, historical evaluation, trying to determine the setting of a book or when it was written. Unfortunately, it tends to get taken over by liberal scholarship. And here's what needs to be kept in mind. No matter who you are, efforts to assign dates to biblical books involves presuppositions. Most of the so-called historical criticism approach to the biblical text brings assumptions that the text is only a man-inspired or man-made composition. Much of this study stems back to Germany. It's called the Tübingen School in the 1800s. Now, this might be a bit of an overgeneralization, but the assumption is that God, if he exists, does not communicate to man through a written, inspired text. The Bible is simply a literary, theological construction of man, not the revelation of the Creator to man. So right away, presuppositions are being brought to the table, no matter who you are. Now, the main theory for the more liberal historical critical approach, especially in connection to the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, the main hypothesis of liberal scholarship, it's sometimes called the two-document or the two-source hypothesis. They believe there's two main sources that are the sources for Matthew and Luke. And those two sources are, first of all, the Gospel of Mark. They usually claim that the Gospel of Mark is the earliest gospel written, and it became a source for Matthew and Luke. And then the second source they call Q, from the German word Quelle, I think it's pronounced, which simply means source. And that is a made-up, fictitious source that the scholars believe all the material that's common to Matthew and Luke, but not found in Mark, must have come from some other source, some other document that we don't even have. It's kind of funny they have two-source theory, but one of the sources doesn't actually exist. And this is how they believe the Gospels were formulated. Matthew and Luke are dependent on Mark in one place, and they're dependent on this other non-existent source that they think must have been out there somewhere called Q. And then everybody goes and looks for a historical situation that they think produced the Gospels. And the main hypothesis is that the historical situation that brought about the earliest composition of a Gospel, specifically Mark, was the persecution of Christians by Nero in 64 AD. Supposedly, this severe persecution of the fledgling Christian community brought about the need for a written text to encourage people in this time of difficulty. And the text that was produced was the Gospel of Mark. So Markan priority often goes hand in hand with these theories. dating all the Gospels to after the AD 64 Nero persecutions. So scholars looked for a historical backdrop which they believed generated or necessitated the writing of the first Gospel, and they landed in the middle of the 60s AD. But what if they're wrong? What if their presuppositions misdirected them? Could there be other historical situations that produced the Gospels before that? In a sense, anyone can play the game, and one guess could be as good, even better than another. I think that the motivation of this two-source hypothesis is really to remove the events described in the Gospels, especially the supernatural events, to move them as far away as they can from the written record so that they can cast doubt on the truthfulness of the events. If you can say these events described in the life of Jesus weren't recorded until 30 years later, well, can't really believe they're true. But here's one problem with this secular historical criticism hypothesis. The historical reconstruction posited by modern critics is illogical. It makes no sense to believe that 30 or 40 years after Jesus lived, that this persecuted religious group decided to claim that Jesus was able to perform the multitude of miracles recorded in the Gospels. Let me make a comparison. I'm speaking this in 2024. There's an Orthodox Jewish religious group called Chabad who believe that their religious leader, Menachem Mendel Schneerson, is the Messiah. But he died 30 years ago in 1994. What would be the likelihood of a group from Chabad, this Orthodox Jewish group, getting together today and writing biographies about Rabbi Schneerson, but now claimed that for 3 years, between 1991 and 94, 30 years ago, Menachem Schneerson gave sight to the blind, healed the lame, the deaf, the dumb, lepers, the demon-possessed, and a multitude of others from various diseases. And on 3 occasions, he raised the dead. And then after being put to death himself, he was raised from the dead a few days later. He met with some of his followers over a period of 40 days and then was bodily taken to heaven. What's the problem? The story wouldn't take. Nobody would believe it. People would realize they're trying to make something up. Many people who are alive today were around in 1991 and 1994. They'd easily be able to show that these claims were bogus. The more logical explanation concerning Jesus, the better historical reconstruction of what actually did happen, is that the fantastic claims about Jesus were factual. They were known both during his lifetime and after, and as much as those who didn't believe the claims tried to debunk them, they were not able to do so. In fact, Jesus' followers, including James the Apostle, was put to death in AD 41. That's less than 10 years after Jesus' resurrection. And James, the brother of Jesus, about 30 years after Jesus' resurrection, was also put to death, both insisting that all these things that happened were true. So here's a better suggestion about the relationship of one gospel to another. And that's that the similarities and differences in the Gospels are best understood as eyewitness reports, or based on eyewitness reports, that they're facts. But since 4 different witnesses are recording events that actually happen, we should expect both similarities. Yes, one report could have access to an earlier report, and differences of perspective. The differences and similarities in parallel passages are contrasts of perspective that would be expected when eyewitnesses are involved. So now what I would like to do is suggest some other historical backdrops that would perhaps necessitate or generate the narrative about Jesus becoming written text. And all of these possibilities are much earlier than the 64 AD persecutions of Nero. First, while the culture of first century Israel involved much oral learning and repetition, Peter, Matthew, Mark, and the other disciples were literate. I sometimes hear people say that these guys were illiterate, but I think that's bunk. Israelites, not just the upper class, were expected to be able to read and to be familiar with the Torah. They believed that knowing the Torah was a matter of life and death. As people of the book, they learned letters and language as children because they believed that God had supernaturally communicated with them via written text. Outside of the Bible, historical writings like those of Flavius Josephus show great literary ability stemming from first century Israel. Archaeological finds, too, at a place like Qumran testify to an ability and abundance of literary activity in first century Israel. It's not impossible that some followers of Jesus made written records soon after events occurred. The events happening in association with the man Jesus were so unique. Nothing like this has ever been seen in Israel, recorded in Matthew 9:33, that the events themselves could have stirred some written record. Next, immediately after Pentecost, that's 50 days after Jesus was crucified and raised from the dead, as Acts 2:42 states, the believers in Jerusalem, quote, devoted themselves to the apostles' teaching and fellowship, unquote. This commitment to the apostles' teaching undoubtedly involved oral telling, retelling, and memorization, but could well have involved a commissioning of someone, say Matthew, to produce a written record of the events and teachings of Jesus. A written text would meet the needs of the growing body of Israelite believers in the land of Israel. In other words, here's a historical situation soon, immediately after Jesus was on earth, which could have been an impetus for a written record of the life of Jesus. And this suggestion is not just a shot in the dark. The earliest church fathers' tradition concerning the Gospels is from a guy named Papias. He lived in Hierapolis, which is in central Turkey. He's quoted by Eusebius in Eusebius's History of the Church, writing in the mid-4th century. He wrote, quote, Matthew composed the sayings in the Hebrew language, and everyone interpreted as he was able, unquote. So here is an early record that Matthew was the first one who wrote in the Hebrew language. It might be Aramaic, but probably actually Hebrew. Now later in the 2nd century, Irenaeus states, quote, Matthew brought out a written gospel among the Jews in their own language, unquote. So the earliest tradition we have for the writing of a gospel is that Matthew wrote for the Israelites in the land of Israel. Third, another historical situation that could have spurred the writing of a written record of Jesus. In Acts chapter 11, verses 19 through 26, this occurred in the late 30s AD, early 40s. There was a dispersion of disciples following the stoning of Stephen. Disciples arrived at, for example, Antioch of Syria. Diaspora Jews and eventually even Gentiles were coming to the faith. Such evangelistic activity would have been greatly enhanced, perhaps even produced and accompanied by a written narrative of the life of Jesus. Ask any missionary if you want printed literature. It's very helpful in getting the message across to more than one person. In other words, less than 10 years after the resurrection, the declaration of the gospel of Jesus the Christ outside of the land of Israel is another historical backdrop that may have generated a written record. Fourth, Acts chapter 12, AD 44. This is about 10 years after Jesus ministered. One of the inner 3 apostles, James, the brother of John, was murdered by Herod Agrippa I. And then Herod Agrippa also put the apostle Peter in prison intending to execute Peter too. Although Peter was miraculously released from prison, the disciples would have realized, if they had not by that time, that these eyewitnesses to Jesus' life could die or be killed. All the eyewitness testimony of the Apostle James, one of the inner three, he was with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration, for instance, gone. James is dead. Could the same thing happen to the Apostle Peter and the other apostles? Could we lose their eyewitness testimony? Such a realization would have been a huge motivator to interview and record what the apostles, like Peter, had seen and heard while they were with Jesus. Liberal critical scholars seem to miss such a possibility. I've never heard any of them ever suggest this possibility, but it's very likely. The statement in Acts chapter 12, verse 24, that in spite of the circumstances, right, the death of James and the imprisonment of Peter, perhaps even because of the circumstances, quote, the word of the Lord continued to grow and multiply, unquote. This may once again imply written text. And perhaps it's not a coincidence that the very next verse, Acts 12:25, mentions John Mark going with Paul and Barnabas to Antioch. Did they take John Mark because he wrote the Gospel of Mark at that time as Peter's recorder? Peter's testimony would add weight to Paul's and Barnabas's efforts in foreign lands. Again, as the church historian Eusebius, quoting Papias, stating that Matthew first composed his gospel in Hebrew, he also quotes Papias as stating that Mark wrote a record of Jesus' life and sayings at the dictation of Peter. So again, that putting to death of James, the brother of John, and imprisonment of Peter, that would have been a wake-up call for the believers to get something written down if they hadn't by that time. Next, Acts chapter 13, AD 45. Still only some 12 years after Jesus' ministry, Paul started on his first missionary journey. Again, this may be the reason why Paul and Barnabas took John Mark with them, because Mark had been instrumental in recording Peter's testimony about Jesus' life. Even after a falling out, Paul eventually changed his mind about Mark, writing toward the end of his life, quote, "Get Mark and bring him with you. He is very useful in serving me." That's 2 Timothy 4:11. On that first missionary journey, about 45 AD, the proconsul of Cyprus, Sergius Paulus, believed, quote, "for he was astonished at the teaching of the Lord," unquote. That's Acts 13:12. Was the teaching of the Lord Jesus that Sergius Paulus heard from the Apostle Paul and Barnabas only oral, or was there also a written record brought along by John Mark? In any case, he's hearing the teaching of the Lord Jesus. There is evidence in Paul's sermons in the book of Acts that he's familiar with the statements in the Gospels. He knows about John the Baptist saying, "After me comes one who I am not worthy to untie the sandals of his feet," which we have a record of in Mark and Luke. And also reading through Paul's first epistles, it's apparent that Paul was familiar with the sayings of the Gospels. Is this evidence that Paul had, or at least had previous access to a written gospel record? One could say at least Matthew, one could easily say Matthew and Mark. Late in his life, Paul expressed the value of written documents. He said, "Bring the parchments." It would not be a stretch to think these included a gospel record. Next, Luke wrote the book of Acts in the early AD 60s. That's where his narrative ends, before the persecutions of Nero in 64-65. The Gospel of Luke would have been written before that, before the book of Acts. The Gospel of John is an interesting story as well, which many date as the latest gospel and put somewhere in the AD 90s. It has indications that it was written much earlier. For instance, John narrates chapter 5, verse 2, "Now there is," present tense, "in Jerusalem by the sheep gate, a pool in Hebrew called Bethesda. That's a statement that sounds like it was written before the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. There's a book by J.A.T. Robinson called Redating the New Testament. He argues for earlier datings of the Gospels, including the Gospel of John. I haven't read the book. I have a feeling I'll agree with a lot of what he says. So all that to say, keep in mind that guesses about when the Gospels were written are just that, guesses. We really don't know for sure. But current theories that the Gospels weren't written until the AD 60s and later are based on presuppositions that doubt the veracity of the Gospels, particularly the miraculous. The attempt is to move the written records of the events to decades after the events happened in an effort to cast doubt on the trustworthiness of the record. These skeptical scholars have looked for a historical setting decades after Jesus was on earth for evidence of a time that could have produced the gospel narratives. But anybody can play this game. Many prior historical events, which could have been the impetus or the reason for a written record of the life of Jesus, are ignored. Perhaps the best example, as I mentioned, is AD 41, when James, the brother of John, was put to death and the life of Peter was threatened by the government in control in Israel at the time. And the liberal critical theories have crept into all levels of Christianity. One doesn't have to look far to find, even among conservative Bible believers, proclamations like, quote, the Synoptic Gospels were written in the mid-60s AD. Really? That claim doesn't make much sense, and there are lots of other reasons to believe that the Gospels were written much earlier. Anyone can play the historical guessing game. My guess may actually be better than yours. I think it's important to keep in mind that the writing of the Gospels was not just a response, for instance, to Nero's persecution or something like that, but was a taking of the initiative to make the message about God's work through Jesus known to many. That happened much earlier than AD 64. May the Word of God continue to grow and multiply. Yishma'u anavim v'yismachu, the humble will hear and rejoice.